Thanks, Haley, and thanks, Greg, and thanks everyone for coming along. I see some familiar names in the list from recent collaborations, from historic collaborations, and some from a very long time ago. Peter O'Regan, I saw your name on the list. So great to be with you, and also good to see that it's biased towards Northern Australia, because that's the way I've structured the talk somewhat as well. I thought I'd start with a bit of an introduction as to, well, where is the drive coming from, who's asking about carbon neutral agriculture, and then go into some of the options that we've got to respond in terms of methane, soil carbon, a little bit on nitrous oxide, and where this is headed. And so we know that the Paris Climate Agreement, prior to this, there was some discussion about carbon neutrality, but it really was the first time that it got put on the agenda that there was a target to achieve a climate neutral world. Now, interesting, Paris said climate neutral, but not carbon neutral. The supply chain and the industries have all assumed carbon neutral from that. But under climate neutral, things like methane don't need to be absolute zero to achieve climate neutrality. So that's something we can talk about. But the COP26 recent Glasgow agreement has stepped up the ambition short term. So it said not just 2050, we actually want some ambition by 2030. And so a lot of countries have signed up to that, and also put a 30% proposed reduction in methane on the table, which 150 countries have signed up to. So that's going to up the pressure. But I'd like to put it to you that I don't think it's governments that are actually running the show as much as the supply chain when it comes to agriculture. And so what I've got here is just a listing of some of the companies in the multinational agribusiness supply chain and the targets that they have set. Now, we developed 3 pages of this type of information about 10 years ago, and it was all emissions intensity calculations. After Paris, all of these companies have steadily switched to absolute emission reduction targets. And the most recent is Heineken basically saying to all barley malt growers in Australia, we want to only source carbon neutral barley malt. JBS has recently come on board with their target, which put us on notice. And so you can see how this was cascade through to a day by 2030 where carbon neutral supply is going to be very much demanded. If you take the bottom left 2 there, Rabobank and NAB, they represent about 50% of the agri-debt market in Australia, and they are both aiming for net zero financed emissions by 2050. So it's going to become harder to actually get loans from them. Now, I would put to you a statement out of the Financial Times a couple of years back, and I'm sure it's actually changed even more since then. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, 69 are companies, not countries. So the organizations you're seeing on the screen here are part of the rising location of wealth that is not country-based, but it is multinational-based. And they are appealing to shareholder value, and the shareholders want to know, well, what does the consumer want? So actually, it's all driven by consumer preference change over time that we need to go down this route. So I think government policy is probably only influential in allocating funding into research to deliver carbon neutral agriculture. Beyond that, whether they or don't set targets has actually become quite irrelevant. So we've seen other industries respond. This is one of the reasons why the red meat industry has set the carbon neutral CN30 goal. We've seen competitors around the world. The state of Mato Grosso do Sul has got its carbon neutral initiative, which includes livestock. We've seen the carbon neutral Brazilian beef brand come out of Embrapa in Brazil. Now, between you and me and the walls, and hopefully no one from Embrapa is listening, it's not vaguely carbon neutral in terms of strict accounting, but it doesn't get in the way of a good marketing story. So that's the world we're in right now. We've seen New Zealand set their net zero bill, which has set all long-lived gases to be net zero by 2050, but has not set a zero target for methane. They've been quite smart. They haven't tried to fiddle with the metrics of methane. They've said, well, that GWP 100 is there, let's work with it. But let's say that methane only has to be somewhere around 30% less by 2050 to achieve the same equitable contribution to warming. We've seen California put a cap on methane 40% less by 2030, and that has put a lot of pressure on particularly the confinement livestock industries in dairy and beef in California. And then, as I mentioned at the COP meeting, the Global Methane Pledge, which was pledging 105 countries pledging 30% less methane by 2030. So it's all happening. There's a lot happening in this space, and we need to know how to respond. We have seen some responses. So we've seen, well, it's just a quick web search here, and I'll show you, two sort of extremes. Three livestock red meat suppliers that are now carbon neutral. They've done an audit either through Climate Active or through the Carbon Reduction Institute. To be fair, mainly they've bought offsets to deliver that carbon neutrality rather than actually make major changes on farm, but that's what we'll talk about. And then on the other side of the spectrum, obviously a lot easier for a wine producer to be carbon neutral. All they've got to worry about is trellis poles rather than anything substantial. Don't want to play it down too much, but it's a lot more to achieve carbon neutrality as a livestock operation. Now, why should we care? Here's two statements. One from President Joe Biden, who said we will tax countries' exports to make it equitable for our US workers not to be disadvantaged by our internal policies. We've seen the EU Environment Minister make a clear statement with reference to Australia that the European Union will start taxing imports with countries that don't have a carbon price internally or an equitable contribution internally. Now, we've got to remember that about 70% of Australian agricultural produce is exported. And at the COP meeting, the Climate Change Performance Index, now we hate these indices and they're all very subjective, but Australia unfortunately did rank last on the Climate Change Performance Index. And that is the index that is used to decide whether a country does or doesn't have sufficient ambition and whether to consider a carbon border adjustment tariff on a country based on their lack of ambition. So I'll put it to you, we're going to pay it somewhere along the line. Someone's going to pay somebody. And the only choice we've got is, do we keep the revenue in Australia and use it to develop the industry to be carbon neutral, or do we pay it out to the European Union for them to accept our products? Someone's going to have to pay that money somewhere along the line, and I would put it to you, it's far better for us to pay it internally into the industry so we keep a viable industry into the future rather than just pay it out to an external company as a tax. So let's define what we're talking about. Well, we're talking about carbon farming here, and that's management principles that minimize greenhouse gas emissions, so methane, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, maximize carbon storage, carbon sequestration in the landscape in either trees or soils. But the important part of the definition is it still is about improving productivity and resilience of our agricultural systems. What's carbon neutral or net zero emissions? Carbon neutral is very similar, but it says let's minimize the amount of greenhouse gas emissions we produce, and let's knock off the balance of that with carbon offsets, carbon storage. So in other words, we get our emissions down as far as possible, and right now we could probably reduce methane by as much as 70 or 80% if we needed to, but there'll still be a residual. So in 20 years' time, there'll still be some greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture that we will need our own offsets to knock off that balance to get us to net zero. So I thought I'd just take a moment to explain the carbon cycle, because we have a lot of producers say, well, why don't I get given a credit for all the carbon that I've got stored up in my pastures or that I accumulate in my pastures? And so in this diagram, I've got carbon labeled in red, so you can follow the carbon. And you've got CO2 in the atmosphere, and it comes down in photosynthesis, and we capture it in plants in our pastures. But note that once it's captured in the plant, it's not a gas, it's a sugar. So carbon is not carbon. CO2 is the one form, and then once it's in carbohydrate, it's a sugar. Now, some of it goes back in respiration, but on balance, we're trapping that carbon in photosynthesis. When we put an animal on this pasture, granted, most of what goes back to the atmosphere is just CO2 as the animal belches and breathes out. And if that's all that happened, it would be a completely neutral cycle. Carbon in, carbon out, within 12 months, all going back to the atmosphere. Completely neutral. Unfortunately, a small amount, and I do stress it's a small amount, of that carbon dioxide becomes methane. Now you see it's CH4. It's a gas, but it's not the same gas as CO2. And unfortunately, the more bonds you've got in a molecule, the more it heats the atmosphere. So you've got methane with carbon and 4 hydrogens, and it absorbs more infrared radiation than CO2 does. It will eventually oxidize back to CO2 after about 14 years on average. But while it's in the atmosphere, it's doing damage. So we've got to minimize that in carbon farming. So that's the imbalance. We've got feces, carbon that goes to the soil. We've got litter that are plant litter that falls on the soil surface, and some of that is oxidized back to the atmosphere. We've got roots, and these roots are laying down soil organic carbon all the time into the soil. Now, see, it's soil organic carbon. It's not a gas. It's an organic fraction of carbon in various sugars. And the roots can do that either through root exudates, sugars into feed, say fungi in the soil, or they can do just by sloughing off or breaking off roots into the soil and leaving soil carbon behind. And that breaks down into either a very fast turnover fraction of the larger particulate organic carbon. That's the fractions that turn over within days through to weeks and supply a lot of the nutrients back to the farm, back to the soil. So most of the turnover of nitrogen that you're getting out the soil is from microbes working on those particulate organic carbon, freeing it up and allowing you to grow more grass. As those fractions break down into smaller components, they become humus in the soil. So that's the more recalcitrant, slower turnover fraction. That can last for 25 to 100 years in the soil. Now, in carbon farming, what we want for healthy, productive pastures is we want the microbes to have a go at that. We want that is food for microbes in the soil. They're breaking down that all the time, and what they're doing is releasing the nutrients that are stored, like the nitrogen that is stored in those pastures, feeding back to grow more grass for next year. So you want most of that in a fast turnover pool of carbon. Unfortunately, we don't realize that sometimes we're at different objectives here. When we're trying to sell carbon, we want it in a very slow form. When we want to get the maximum soil health benefit and the maximum turnover fractions, we want it all in a fast pool. They're not always the same thing, and people don't realize that. But the bottom line is this is food for microbes, and if in a fully balanced system where everything is stable, the microbes will eat up and send back to the atmosphere the CO2 back to where it came from, and that cycle will be completely neutral apart from the methane that is left behind. So in carbon farming, what do we want? We want the maximum amount of carbon to come out of the atmosphere through the animal into a product that we sell down the supply chain. That's not a store of carbon. You and I eat those products, and within 12 months, we respire it back as CO2 to the atmosphere. It goes back to the cycle. So we want to store carbon in the soil if we can. So if the potential to store more soil carbon. We want to plant trees in the landscape if we can. That'll store carbon. And we want to minimize the amount of methane. So when you're looking at the carbon cycle and you're saying, how do we evaluate where the carbon is in the landscape from a carbon farming point of view, most of that cycle is completely transient. What goes in is gone back to the atmosphere within 12 months, apart from where carbon stops in the landscape for decadal time steps. Where it can stop for decadal time steps is in the soil, in the slower pool. In trees, it can stop in the landscape, or it can stop in the form of methane for 14 years at a time. That's what makes a difference. The rest is completely neutral and is not a stock or an ever accumulating source of carbon. So hopefully that's clear. So when we're doing a carbon account on a property, we look at the total emissions, the net emissions per business unit. So how many tons of greenhouse gases were produced, minus how much is stored in soils and trees, what came onto the property in terms of embedded greenhouse gas emissions in fertilizers, and we add those all up and express it per business unit, all right, per farm boundary. A carbon footprint just says, well, let's take that same analysis and divide it by the tons of live weight or the tons of milk solids or the ton of grain produced. So those are the two main metrics. I would put it to you that a carbon footprint, which is what goes down the supply chain, is what the supply chain is interested in, but it's actually just a very good efficiency metric. It just says how efficient is this farm at converting atmospheric CO2 and sunlight into a product that matters to the supply chain. So you could say in a northern beef property, you can go from somewhere below 10 tons of CO2 emissions per ton of product through to about 15 to 18 tons of CO2 per ton of product. So there's a bit of a range in that efficiency metric. Now, there's a couple of caveats in here. We know that the deadline is coming where we will need to demonstrate carbon neutrality. Right now, there are premium markets available for example, carbon neutral wool. So we did a carbon audit on a livestock property in Western Victoria that is now accessing premium wool markets in Italy and New Zealand that are carbon neutral supply chains. So they're getting a premium price. I would put it to you that by 2030, 2035, maybe 2040 at the latest, we would just see this as a compliance issue. It's a market access issue because the supply chain are setting targets by those dates. So we're in that transition phase from being a premium to being a future supply chain. You can see trading carbon credits as another option. So you can either keep your carbon to yourself, as the Jigsaw Farms example, the Western Victorian farm. They have not engaged in carbon markets. They've just got us to do a carbon audit and demonstrated they're carbon neutral. No trading, no paperwork, just a peer-reviewed paper that said they were carbon neutral. You can go down the emissions reduction fund, which I call a regulatory market. So it's a government process where you sell carbon credits back to government under the emission reduction fund. And the government then retires those carbon credits against the national account. Now, I would argue that if the government is retiring those carbon credits, they're not retiring them against the coal industry or the fossil fuel industry or the power stations. They're retiring them generically. I would argue, and we still need clarity from government on this, but I would argue that those carbon credits should still be claimable by the sector that generated them or the farm that generated them, because they're not being double counted. They're just being retired generically. Still to be clarified, but I think that would be an important point for the livestock industries. You could engage in the voluntary market, gold standard, the Vera secondary market, selling your carbon ACCUs from Australia to a power station, for example, and you'd get more money that way right now because those are selling for between $30 and $90 a ton, whereas the emission reduction fund on the reverse auction will probably only give you about, I think it's about $19 a ton at last trade or maybe less. But what you've got to remember is there's a risk involved here. And the risk is if you sell a soil carbon credit, for example, and it goes off to a power station or it goes off to Microsoft or it goes off to another country, it leaves your farm, it leaves your industry, it leaves the country. You can't double claim it anymore because that other entity is claiming it against their obligation. Microsoft would be claiming it, or the law firm or the power station. You can't double count. And the more we sell our soil carbon credits or tree carbon credits outside of our sector, the more vulnerable we will become in the future when we are required to be carbon neutral and need our own carbon offsets to knock off that balance of greenhouse gas emissions. So be very careful about this because I think a lot of people are going to get caught out with short-term gain for long-term pain. There's a fundamental difference as well between selling a carbon sequestration offset, which is a finite accumulating stock. There's only a certain amount of carbon in the soil. It cannot accumulate indefinitely. There's only a certain amount of carbon in trees. It cannot accumulate indefinitely. And we might need those carbon stocks out of that limited bank account. We can't afford to keep selling them. As opposed to an emissions avoidance, where you might go into a herd methodology where you finish your animals a month earlier. That's a month less methane they produced. Therefore, that just never happened. That methane didn't go to the atmosphere. You don't have to spend the next 100 years looking after it. It's a flux. And you can keep selling those methane credits up until the day you have to be carbon neutral, and then you just don't sell them and you're carbon neutral. So we haven't wised up to the difference between these in terms of risk profile. And I would say in future, we're going to see a price differential come into the market where soil carbon is less secure because 90% of soil carbon is about rainfall in grazing systems. Don't believe your management has a massive impact. It probably only has about 10% impact. The rest is all rainfall variability. And so it's less secure as a carbon credit. If I was buying carbon credits, I wouldn't buy soil carbon in a country like Australia where it is 22% more rainfall variable than any other country in the world. So we need to actually look at the future of those. Now, what are farm emission profiles? You can see where some of the debate comes in about the livestock industries versus other industries, where you've got a dairy farm in the top left, you've got a rangeland beef system, at 14 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of live weight. And you can see it's mainly coming from methane in both cases, largest single contribution. Whereas the cropping system in the top right-hand corner would show you it's mainly from nitrous oxide and nitrogen cycling in those cropping systems. But when you look at the emissions intensity, it's less than 1 ton of emissions per ton of grain. Now, we think that's a fairly unfair way of presenting it, and we would rather actually see it presented on a incoming energy versus outgoing energy basis. In other words, of the solar radiation, how much of that energy was then converted into product? We think that would be a fairer way to reflect it. But this is what the market is seeing right now. So what can be done about this? Now, I realize there are some in the audience like Chris McSweeney who knows far more about methane than I do, but bear with me, Chris. I think we'll be talking about some of our joint work together. We've got to remember something about the rumen. Rumen has evolved their four stomachs, and I think I'm right on this, about 50 million years ago. And in 20 or 30 years, we want to change that completely, that steady state. And I've given you some idea of the microbial populations that are present in the rumen. And this goes to the soil as well. The soil has a very similar number of microbes per unit volume. And so adaptation is a major challenge. So we can't just intervene and get rid of the methanogens in the rumen, because re-inoculation is a big issue, adaptation is a big issue. This is a steady state system that's been around for a long time. So it's a big challenge. But at the same time, it's a serious inefficiency with 6 to 10% of gross energy intake lost as methane. And sorry, just go back one. In this slide, I've given you some idea of how much methane is lost from different categories of animals. Now, these figures vary a bit, but this gives you a general idea. But to sort of put it in some practical context, and for the petrol heads that are in the audience, you could say something like a dairy cow in southern Australia produces enough methane to power a 6-cylinder LPG car to drive from Sydney to Melbourne. So that's a fair distance, a fair bit of energy. And so what the research is really trying to do is say, well, how can we cut that back to capture that back into the energy? How can we get that 10% of gross energy back into production? And so there's a couple of things I'll run you through that I think we can do practically. And this would be simple things around animal health, reducing unproductive animal numbers, around animal management, health and nutrition of animals, improving reproductive rates, fertility, weaning percentages, so that you can produce the same amount of product with less animals, or you can reduce the emissions intensity of the production. So one of the projects I'm involved in is, what if we treat all the sheep in East Africa for Haemonchus contortus, stomach worms? And there's a fair bit of savings in efficiency that can result in less emissions intensity as a result. People do talk about breeding. I'm probably more of a fan of breeding for feed conversion efficiency rather than actual methane reduction. So residual methane production is kind of lower heritability, and it'll never become an offset method, quite simply because you're only getting 1% gain per year. And so we struggle with farmer adoption of the incentive of an offset method already. When you can get a 10% reduction in methane, that still doesn't seem to register. So getting a gain of 1% per year is unlikely to incentivize farmers. But also, because it'll get a low weight and a multi-trait index, progress is going to be slow. And I suspect we might just be breeding for a faster rate of passage through the rumen, which would suit the feedlot industry and the dairy industry, but it wouldn't suit the extensive grazing industries where you want a high-functioning rumen. Chris might be able to ask some questions on that later, just to clarify whether I'm on the right track there. But that's my impression, as we could be just breeding for passage rate through the rumen. But feed conversion efficiency is, I think, higher heritability. It would have a higher weight and a multi-trait index. It's already consistent with where industry want to go. And you could look at a future date where you need less animals to have the same amount of product, which means you could have more carbon restoration in the landscape as a result. And so that's where we need to be headed. We do know that digestibility, forage quality makes a difference. So better quality pastures would lead to a greater legume content in our pastures, would lead to finishing animals faster, could lead to a faster rate of passage of rumen contents, so reduce the amount of methane per unit dry matter intake that way. And so we could look at things like plant breeding, where we breed pastures that have better energy to protein ratios, or ironically, we breed pastures that have some secondary compounds back in them, some more tannins in them or oils in them. I say ironically because some of the pasture species we've got, we spent the last 50 years breeding these out of them, and now we're actually thinking we need them back in because they probably were there for a reason in the first place. We've done a lot of work on oils and feeding oils, and shown that for every 1% extra added fat in the diet, you get about 3.5% less methane. So things like canola oil, cold pressed canola, brewer's grain, cottonseed meal are all options that can be looked at. We then moved on to looking at tannins, which would be secondary compounds on a lot of the forage legumes like Leucaena that I'll come to in a moment, and found reductions in methane from that as well. Then we got smart and said, well, can we combine the two and look for a naturally occurring waste product from industry that has both tannin and oil in it? And that's where we came up with grape mark and said, well, actually, it's got tannin in the skin and it's got oil in the seed. Those two together gave us a slight complementary benefit, not a lot, but a little bit extra. You'll see some products coming on the market that, like Mutrail and Agolin, that are based on what we call essential oils, so more concentrated oils, really. And they'll deliver somewhere in the 20% category. So the options I've given you up until now are all those that I think are your do now options, your 20% maximum option, so 10 to 20% reduction in methane. It brings us on some of the work that I've done with Nigel Tompkins, Chris McSweeney, Ed Charmley on, well, in the case of that work, it was more tropical legumes, but I would argue that temperate legumes have the same potential. It's not about the tropical versus temperate, it's about the secondary compounds they might have in them. And so there's a few options that you can see on the screen. And this is some work that Chris and Nigel Tompkins did with Matthew Harrison and myself, looking at improving the quality of the diet on offer through Leucaena, for example. And you can see how the animals are growing faster on a better quality diet. So that's one component. And I'd put to you, there's a number of components that all add up here with something like legumes. One is the animals will finish earlier, and I'll show you some data on that in a moment. So that's less time they producing methane. Then Nigel measured the methane from these animals and showed that it could be about as much as 20% less methane. So 15 to 20% less methane while they are growing faster. So that's a second effect. It's not the same effect. The ones finishing earlier, the other ones actually producing less while they're finishing. And then we did an irrigated Leucaena case study with Chris Taylor and myself, where this is an actual case study on the Burdekin River, irrigated Leucaena, where they took out about 400 hectares of the Rhodes grass pasture and put irrigated Leucaena in. And if you follow through to the right-hand side, you'll see we went from 0.3 ADG to over 1 kilogram per head per day of growth rate. These are actual farm numbers. And we're able to double the number of steers in the process because you've got better carrying capacity as a result of the Leucaena. But as a result, the greenhouse gas emissions intensity, which is the third last column, so that's that per ton of live weight, that dropped from 8.4 to 3.9. Now that's quite substantial. But look what happened to the greenhouse gas emissions. We doubled the animal numbers for about the same greenhouse gas emissions. So there are very few options that exist that can improve emissions intensity and absolute emission reductions. And here is an example where I think we did quite well. But then there's more to that. What we did is we parameterized the model that could track the soil carbon benefits of irrigated Leucaena. And this was fascinating in that what we were able to do was show all the pools of carbon from the left-hand side across. So there's an establishment period there, and then those bottom bits and pieces is all the mass of carbon in the Leucaena trees and the debris and all that. But the total black line at the top includes this gray line where you see a bit of a drop in soil carbon during the disturbance phase, and then a jump in soil carbon, because what we were doing is putting a legume into a grassland system that was nitrogen deficient. And so you're supplying an essentially missing nutrient that allows Rhodes grass to grow that much better and lay down better root systems as a result. And that's where the soil carbon came from in this particular study. So I'd put it to you, these are some things we should be looking at in the future. Now, just when you think you've got it all under control, you find that there's a product that comes along out of left field and says, well, hang this device around the neck of the animal and it'll oxidize the methane as it comes out. And ZELP is one of those, offering up to a 53% reduction in methane, solar powered. Have a look at the ZELP website and see what you think. I suspect they like a wind turbine. It's a sort of ugly symbol hanging around a cow's neck like a wind turbine on a top of a hill, telling us we need a better solution long term. But if we needed to get out of trouble quickly and go to low production, we can do it using ZELP. Then we step it up. So up until now, I've dealt with the sort of more modest issues. Now we come to the potential that to make a bigger impact, and that would be products like methane inhibitors, 3-NOP. Some of the data ranges between 20 and 40% less methane, and some recent studies in feedlots have gone up to 70% less methane. It's registered in Brazil and Chile. It's been given the green light in the European Union. It looks like it'll be rolled out in New Zealand next year. So it's a product that's coming through. It has 48 peer-reviewed publications sitting behind all aspects of its due diligence. So I would say it's probably ready for market. We've heard a lot about the seaweed, and certainly some impressive results. I think Nigel Tompkins was involved in some of this work. 80% less methane from animals fed on Asparagopsis. I do think there's some due diligence still to go. It's not quite as market ready as 3-NOP, but it is very promising in terms of the potential. We've heard a lot about a methane vaccine, and I would be expecting that in the next few years we will see something in a methane vaccine which would really be applicable to the more extensive grazing industries. And then finally, one to throw to Chris McSweeney as a lifetime challenge, the concept of early life programming. It's something that's been around for a while, but if you look at that graph on the bottom right, this is something I have a lot of hope in. And that is what they did in this experiment was feed that 3-NOP inhibitor through the weaning phase of the animals, and then withdrew the inhibitor, and the animals stayed about 20% less methane for the rest of the experiment. And it opens up the door for the potential for actually training or programming animals to produce less methane, which, if you think about it, that's probably the holy grail of where we would love to get to one day in the future. So I've dealt with those, sorry. And this summarizes the things we can do now. Sorry, go back one. What we can do now around the 10 to 20% options, up to the 50% options, and on the right-hand side, what is coming down the pipeline in the next 5 to 10 years. Really what we do need on the right-hand side with the inhibitors is slow-release technology to allow the more extensive grazing industries access to those same technologies. How are we going on time, Hayley? Are we... I might just...
You're fine. You can keep going for a little bit if you like, Richard.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'll go quickly through nitrous oxide, and that's just because a lot of the nitrous oxide issues are really related to intensive fertilizer use, which is probably less applicable to this group. But I'd put it to you that nitrous oxide is all about input-output equations. The more input you put into the nitrogen cycle, the more you're going to lose as nitrous oxide. And that's what those graphs at the bottom are showing. Typical fertilizer response curve, and the nitrous oxide loss curve. But how do we slow down that nitrogen cycle? Well, you slow it down by bringing in legumes instead of nitrogen fertilizer. We know a lot of nitrous oxide comes from urine animals. I'll deal with that in a moment. But in terms of soil management, we've got to look at more efficient use of the nitrogen we have in the soil. We've got to look at reducing compaction and saturation, definitely reducing soil disturbance and water management in soils. The main issue with the livestock industries is urine, that a large portion of what is excreted in urine is just liquid urea, really. And that a ruminant will apportion about 50-50 of the nitrogen in its diet between dung and urine when the nitrogen is limited. But when it gets more than its required daily intake, it increasingly proportions it into the urine, which is highly volatile and can be lost as ammonia, but also contribute to greenhouse gases. And so you could see something there of the nitrogen content in a urine patch. So, you know, a beef cow on adequate crude protein intake would excrete somewhere between 200 and 400 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year equivalent in that urine patch. So it's not surprising that it's not efficiently recycled. So we've got to do something better about that. And one of the things we can do is just get a more balanced energy to protein ratio into the animal. Some of the options around that would be looking at legumes again. So the tannins, because tannins are known to bind crude protein in the bind protein in the rumen of the animal. That's okay if you're on an adequate diet of protein, but if you're on a very low protein diet and you introduce a legume, a tannin containing legume, you can end up in a protein deficiency as a result of it binding too much. But what we found in some of the work is, some of the work we published finds that protein complex then is more efficiently utilized lower down in the abomasum of the animal, and they get better nitrogen uptake by digesting that organic bound complex. It excretes it more in the dung than the urine because it's taking it out in the dung form rather than urine, and that's less volatile, and it's slower in the nitrogen cycle in the soil. Just to leave you with an idea on where things could go, there is some research that would show that some grass species like Brachiaria have a natural nitrification inhibitor in their root exudates, and it blocks the formation of nitrous oxide under species like Brachiaria. Now, this can be selected and can be introduced into some of our pasture species over time. So rather than using chemical inhibitors, this could be built up over time. So just pointing to the future. I'd like to end with soil carbon, just a few thoughts on that now. Here's a dramatic slide, and it's a cropping system, yes, but it's from central New South Wales. Peter Grace gave me the photo. And the left is the height of the soil profile, and the right is where it used to be 100 years ago. And the difference is loss of soil carbon. Not necessarily surface erosion as much, just there's a huge soil carbon difference between what it used to be before it got compacted down with less soil carbon. So you can see the major impact that soil carbon can have to the health of our soils. Now, soil carbon is just a simple input-output equation. It's about plant growth putting carbon in, or if you're importing carbon in the form of chicken litter, or you're importing it in terms of biochar or something. But let's assume that most of the carbon that goes in is from plant growth. So that's really rainfall dependent. Good rainfall years, you'll get lots of carbon. Low rainfall years, you'll lose carbon. On the output side, it's mainly the microbes. Remember that cycle I showed you? It's turning it over and just letting it go back to the atmosphere. Now, in a high rainfall year, you get lots of good inputs. You know, grow 6 tons of pasture maybe. In a high rainfall year, the bugs are working heavily and they send it back to the atmosphere in that cycle. The problem with soil carbon in Australia in particular is in a drought, the inputs go down. And so you've got half the amount of pasture growth in a La Nina year than you do in an El Nino year than you do in a La Nina year. The problem is, unless the soil is completely dry, the bugs are still working at about the same pace. And so they're sending out the CO2 at the same rate as they did last year in the high rainfall year. The difference is you're putting less in, and the balance changes. And so that's why we've actually found that in Australia, rainfall has an overriding effect on the net balance of soil carbon over time. It doesn't mean to say you shouldn't build soil carbon. It does mean to say there's a risk in thinking that it will save the day in terms of carbon balance. Now, there's all sorts of benefits as to why we should build soil organic matter. And note I changed terminology from soil carbon to soil organic matter, because soil carbon, if you want soil carbon, you just burn it all and stick it in the soil as charcoal. That doesn't give you any of the productivity benefits. Soil organic matter, which is about double soil carbon, gives you all these benefits of biological roles, physical roles, chemical roles in the soil, every reason why there is a productivity benefit that is orders of magnitude bigger than the carbon trading benefit of soil carbon. I would say that again. A scenario we did in Western Victoria, down in Victoria, where we looked at the inherent productivity benefits of quantifying those biological physical roles, was about $150 of extra hay production per hectare, compared to a carbon trading benefit of $15 to $20 per hectare per year. So let's not get in the ditch on where the benefit lies. But let's also recognize that it takes a long time for soil carbon to replenish. So if you destroy it with disturbance, like on the left-hand side of this graph, it'll take probably 25 to 50 years of initial increase before it starts leveling off, and then it takes a long time to recover. But the blue line shows us that it'll take a very short amount of time to destroy it again. So if you replenish soil carbon, go to permanent pasture from out of a cropping phase, for example, long-term permanent deep-rooted pasture, you can start rebuilding soil carbon. If you then plow it, or you stop fertilizing it, or you stop irrigating it, it just goes down the blue line back to where it came from. So we've got to remember that in building soil carbon. And here's this correlation we came up with where we showed that the majority of the annual season-to-season variation in soil carbon flux in grazing systems, in long-term grazing systems, is just related to rainfall. You can see at the higher rainfall site, probably less correlated because rainfall is not as limiting at Hamilton. But when you go to a more inland site like Birchip, most of your soil carbon flux between years is dependent on growing season rainfall. That's under long-term grazing. Now, to finish off, just wanted to highlight some of the problems we've got at the moment where there's a lot of evangelism, I would say, around soil carbon. And there are people running around making promises to farmers that are just unrealistic and unfortunately skews the discussion about all the benefits of building soil carbon and skews it in favor of saying you can get all this money. Now, here's a table of the actual soil carbon offset method that the government offers, saying if you convert from cropping to pasture in a good rainfall zone, you could get 0.23 tons of carbon per hectare per year. Unfortunately, look up tables from some of the aggregators, and unfortunately in this case, it appeared in the government's own long-term emission reduction plan, an unpeer-reviewed source that is offering for that higher rainfall zone. If you look at the numbers there of 0.68 and 0.9, those are numbers that are well over double what the government's own promises would be. So we've got to be really careful, because here are some estimates of what could be achieved in soils, and you can see what is being promised to farmers is quite a lot higher than what we think is possible. So we have to be very cautious about that. So Haley, I'll probably stop there because I think that's probably enough from me at the moment.